welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your host for today, and today I'm here with the author of a very interesting new post-apocalyptic novella. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Meridel Newton, and my book is The Future Second by Second. It's a new novella out from Interstellar Flight Press, and if you like post-apocalyptic stories, this is kind of a new twist on the genre for you.
Nice, thank you. So could we start out with you telling me a little bit about your writing career and how it led you to this novella?
Oh, sure. So I've been writing for about as long as I can remember. My very, very first published item was in a fanzine when I was maybe 3 or 4 years old.
Oh,
And
no.
my dad asked me if I wanted to write a story, and I had never come across this concept before. I had no idea that, I could write a story. So I actually made up this very silly story about a fairy who went to the wrong house when she tried to go home. And I dictated it to my dad, and he wrote it down and sent it in.
That's amazing.
And I've been writing for as long as I can remember since then, with varied success. But I do have a couple other things published. Maybe 8 years ago, I self-published a YA urban fantasy novel. And more recently, I've had another novella out actually from Giganotosaurus, which is an online zine. And those are the big things. Oh, and I had a story in an anthology called Recognize Fascism last year, actually. So that was another big one.
Oh, interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about that anthology? That sounds really cool.
Oh, sure. That is an anthology. It was actually kickstarted, but it was out from Worldweaver Press, and it was a direct response to the previous president's administration. It's got over 20 different authors writing short stories, science fiction, and I think a couple are fantasy, a little bit fantasy as well. But every story is about realizing that the world you're in is becoming more fascistic, and what you can do in response to that, and how you can even in small ways, protest and resist.
That is really interesting. And I think it leads us into this novella in some interesting ways, because I think a common thread I'm seeing is that it's very realistic about what's going on in the world around us, but also hopeful, and I think that's a very interesting mood to be kind of hitting. So this novella, The Future Second by Second, is the first in a series from Interstellar Press. Am I correct about that?
A trilogy, yes. It's very exciting. It's their first trilogy, actually, or their first even, ongoing series. So.
Very nice. I'm very excited to learn more about, this world and this story that gets set up and, other possibilities that might be on the horizon. Could you tell me a little bit about Osto, which is the community that's at the center of your novella?
Yes, I can, actually. There's a lot about Osto that exists only in my head so far and hasn't been written down on the page.
Ooh.
Osto is a community that was founded relatively soon after the apocalyptic event in this world. The story itself, the novella, takes place about 80 years after the apocalypse, which is unnamed and undetailed in the story, but more will be revealed as the series goes on. Osto was founded by a small group of survivors who decided that their best chance of survival was to find a fortification and a place that already had a bunch of supplies and to kind of dig in. And what they found was sort of a big box store. Think like Walmart or Costco or something like that. They found one, they took it over, they dug in and fortified it. And then as they continued to survive and thrive, they sort of decided what their philosophy was going to be, and they turned it into a working village. And they deliberately set out to make themselves a sort of welcoming oasis among the chaos of the apocalypse.
And I find that so refreshing, because a lot of apocalyptic fiction, especially in the last like 15 or so years, let's say,
Mhm.
kind of takes the form of like a power fantasy for people who are like already powerful, like you have a lot of like, not to
Yeah.
besmirch any particular apocalyptic properties, but you just get a lot of like violent power fantasies, and I think this is a really nice tonic to like the kind of post-apocalyptic story that is dominating right now.
I I would agree. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. I love post-apocalyptic stories. I think it's a great premise to start on, and some of the ones that I've read in the past or watched on TV, I've really enjoyed, but they always kind of they skim over the parts that I'm most interested in to get to the violent conflict parts of the story. And I always want them to dig more into how they're repurposing, the parts of the old wind turbine that they found, and how are they rediscovering, water-based agriculture and like irrigation systems and things like that. Like that's what I want to read more about. So
Yeah, me too. I think that's super interesting. And I think another thing that you do that's really interesting and unique is that you're taking this long view. So this is like several generations after the apocalyptic event has happened, and so many of those stories sort of like devolve in the immediate aftermath. And so taking this long view kind of lets you get more into like the kind of like daily lived experience, in this world.
yeah, one of the reviewers actually made that point, and I thought it was really funny that it is in fact a post-apocalypse story as opposed to a peri-apocalypse story.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Um, so I'd like to talk a little bit about like how you manage like the tone and the like the feeling of this book, because it's really optimistic, but it is also very realistic. Like there is some conflict, there are some like little outbursts of violence, but there's also a lot of hope and a lot of appeals to our higher selves. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, like, how did you walk that line? How do you balance that?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that I think every author considers pretty much every character they write has some aspect of themselves in it.
Mhm.
Um, and I try very hard to diversify my characters and make them very different people, but there's always a little bit of myself that I'm like, yeah, that's a thing. That's a characteristic that people have because I have it. I'm going to give it to this character. And so I believe very strongly that people are innately good, and if given the chance, they will choose to do good things that will uh, help people and assist people. And some of my previous life experience has driven home this ideal, which very directly influenced the book. So even the characters that you read even the characters that are supposed to be villains in the story, they have a little bit more of another face to them. They've got a little bit of, well, they are a villain, but why are they a villain? What drove them to this, and why do they think that this is the path that they should take? And if you can understand that, then they're going to feel a little more sympathetic,
Mm.
despite whatever actions they take.
Absolutely. That is a really good point. And I think that, something that I mentioned when I reviewed the book on NetGalley a couple days ago was that it's a very efficient narrative. Like you tell your story like very not succinctly, but just like with narrative efficiency, Yet the characters have all this room to breathe and to really become like real people who you
Mhm.
understand even when you don't really agree with what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so like there really isn't, as you say, this like there's no oversimplified good versus evil. It's really more about like different worldviews clashing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this kind of debate that is happening between like the two rival leaders of Osto, Vasha and Drake. Can you talk a little about them and their conflict, or?
I can definitely do that. So Vasha is the leader of Osto. She's the leader of this village with the philosophy that, they want to be welcoming and helpful to people. She has spent most of her life in this village. Her father was one of the previous leaders. And while she was elected to succeed him, but he also chose her and was like, I would love my daughter to succeed. And the rest of the village was kind of like, okay, that sounds good to us. So she is steeped in this feeling that if you just understand people and try to figure out what makes them tick, then you can then they everybody can work together, basically.
Mm.
Um, Whereas Drake is the leader of this band of raiders that shows up, and they were written to be kind of the characters out of like a Mad Max movie, or your much more typical characters that you would expect to see in a post-apocalyptic story of either giant roaring cars that zoom across the desert, or a group of horsemen in this case. They've got armor, they've got guns, and they have survived in this world by being vicious and hyper masculine, toxically masculine, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is that Drake has been the leader of this group for a while, and he is getting tired. He doesn't quite recognize it himself yet, but it's a repetitive life, and it never seems to move forward. He has no retirement he can look forward to, and things are getting harder out in the western part of the lands where they normally roam. So what he's decided before the book begins is that they're going to start looking for cushier places to be further east, which is how they come to Osto. They've heard the rumors about this village, and when he sees Osto, he sees everything he never thought he could have. And Vasha reads that in him and goes, okay, we can work with this.
Mm. Yeah, something that makes Vasha a really good leader, I think, is that she is capable of reading people and sort of getting at what they actually desire or need underneath what they are saying, And a really interesting way I think that the conflict between Vasha and Drake plays out is that like Vasha kind of believes that like society will flourish if everybody is doing the thing that they are best at, or if they love most, whereas Drake just kind of wants to like slot people into predetermined roles. How else do you sort of see the differences between like their approaches to leadership?
Well, I mentioned toxic masculinity before,
Yeah.
and that is very much the definition of the way Drake leads. It is also, it's just the way that the group is built. They're called Esteban's men in the story, and it's the way the men work. They have a hierarchy, and it's determined by who is the most violent and who is the strongest, and that's how they survive. And it's worked for them for the most part up until this point, but it's also left a trail of destruction in their wake.
Mm.
Um, Whereas Vasha has always seen that when people are happiest, they're the most productive and are more willing to share and be part of the society, basically. So when they meet, it's definitely a clash that these two systems can't work together. And although they both have a history of succeeding, there are cracks in one, whereas the other one just seems to be growing and flourishing more. And it's almost like Drake has almost this consumptive desire towards Osto. Um, but what he doesn't realize is that he's the one being kind of subsumed.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this very interesting, I think, idea that Osto represents, which is sort of like sustainability, whereas the way that like Drake and Esteban's men live is sort of about like short-term survival and doing whatever you need to do like in this exact moment in order to get by, where Vasha and the people of Osto have like a sort of longer view of things. Yeah, I just like really think it's a very interesting way to like portray this kind of debate, because it's not really even between like barbarians and civilization, like because Esteban's men have George, who I think is like one of the best characters. Like he talked a little bit about him too.
Oh, I love George. George is a tinkerer. He's not super committed to the ideals of the men, but he's a scientist. He's a curious man, and he wants to learn and know more. And he works with his hands a lot. It's one of the things he really enjoys to do. Um, I've known people like this in my life. They're always the most fascinating people. They always have this huge workshop in their garages full of all sorts of tools that you want to pick up and play with and learn about. Um, and so George is very much based on some people that I've known in my life. And he fell in with the men because it was the best way that he could see for him to indulge his curiosities and his pursuits. He is their armorer. He is the one that keeps their guns working, because honestly, if you don't constantly maintain a gun, it's going to fall apart in a couple of years. And again, this is 80 years after any guns have been manufactured, so there had to be some way for the guns to, still work as weapons of power. So he's the one that takes care of that. He's also, in his own time, he's pursuing uh, the dream of electricity. Is his big dream. He wants to see that come to life. He's heard about it. He's seen stories. Maybe he's found some old books that portray it in the rubbles of a library somewhere, and that is what he really wants to dig into if he could ever find a place to settle down and like set up shop and have the time to do it. So when they come to Osto, that's what he sees.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like, you know, with Esteban's men, George was kind of doing like what he was good at and what they needed him to do, but he comes to Osto and he gets to kind of like do things that he loves, that he's passionate about. And like watching that character transform in that way is like really just like gave me a warm feeling, just like
Yeah. And he meets Ahmed there, who is very much a like-minded guy. Ahmed's very young. I realize I'm not actually sure if it comes across just how young Ahmed is, but he's supposed to be about 12 or 13. And he is a similarly curious-minded boy. He does have a small library of books that have been rescued, and he's been trying to pursue and recreate things. And when he and George meet, it's just like, oh, I know you. We get each other, even though we have completely different lives and we're completely different ages, but you and I, like, we get each other.
Yeah, and I think they're really nicely emblematic of the way in which like lots of characters who seemingly start out at loggerheads actually like sort of fall into like friendship, like almost against their will sometimes, It's just a really like very, I don't know, very encouraging view of groups coming together and meeting, and it's great. So one of the things that I really loved about this, and I want to kind of talk about this without revealing anything, because I want people to encounter the end without any really previous knowledge, but a lot of the novella seems like it is, you play with a lot of like tropes of post-apocalyptic fiction in fun ways. Like a lot of the novella seems like it is building toward like cataclysm, like that there's going to be like some kind of big conflict because of these running tensions getting heightened. But that's not really what happens. The end doesn't really look that much like the usual endings of these kinds of stories. And so without giving too much away, can you talk a little bit about like your thinking and your motivations in how you wrapped up the story?
I knew from the beginning that how I wanted to end the story is the thing. I knew that if I had something I wanted to say about it, there was only one possible end. And I love Osto. It's kind of my child, my writing child. So I wasn't going to destroy it. But I'm glad to hear you say that there was some doubt about how it was going to go, that it felt like it was going one direction and actually ended up going the other. Because I kind of see the whole story as one of how Esteban's men, the individuals within it are slowly convinced that no, this is the way that we want to be, and they kind of change their philosophy over the course of the day. And yeah, when it came to actually writing that ending, it was surprisingly complicated, because just figuring out the logistics of how it was going to work, and well, how can we make this completely fair, and how can we, how would we actually do this if we don't have modern technology and we don't have like paper and pencil and
Yeah. Yeah, the election itself is not the election, I guess, the vote, because I guess after this trial period of leadership for Drake, they're going to vote on who they think should lead Osto going forward. And it was just really interesting to watch people working together in order to create a fair system, with it was just like a very interesting view, I think, of like not just how people could behave in apocalyptic settings, but perhaps like if we brought this sort of spirit into like our everyday governance, things might be.
yeah. And there are some things in there that are very direct responses to things that have happened in the modern world very recently. Like, I think there's a paragraph in there about how one of the characters wanted to do it as a caucus and have people stand in different corners of the room. And that is a very real thing that happens in the American election system, mostly for primaries, and it's incredibly unfair. because they always have it during like the workday. So only people who either don't have jobs or can afford to take time away from their jobs can attend. So you're automatically excluding an awful lot of people who can't come to the caucus. And then it's also it opens the door up to, intimidation and just personal discussions and bribery, and that sort of system is innately unfair. So I admit, when I wrote that paragraph, I was just like, somebody's going to pick up on this, and
Yeah, that's great. And it is like, you're absolutely correct that like a lot of the ways in which we handle voting in our world are like not always the fairest or most inclusive ways. And I think it was just really exciting to see a world in which inclusivity is the goal, and how that really like allows society to flourish rather than, I guess, bring in a different apocalypse, So,
yeah.
so could you tell us a little bit, without giving too much away, what's in store for Osto?
I can do that. So book 2, I'm working on it right now. It is a little bit of a widening of the world. It's a little bit of a widening of the lens. I have been envisioning, like, this book was very focused. It was one day, it was one village at one conflict, and I envision each book getting a little bit wider and opening it up and revealing more about what's going on. So book 2 will be an encounter between the integrated Osto now with Esteban's men working, and you'll see how that works out and how people are working around the issues that come up between these people who did, have very different upbringings and different philosophies and are now trying to work within this other system. But an encounter between the integrated Osto and a different village, basically. And I'm anticipating it being a really interesting, not conflict per se, but sort of working out of different systems. And yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be fun.
That's great. Sounds fun. And I hope that, when it comes out, you'll consider coming back to talk to us again, because I really can't wait to see what else happens in this world that you've created.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me and our listeners. Listeners, you can find The Future Second by Second now at your favorite library or independent bookstore. This has been Jenn in conversation with Meridel Newton, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.